and I was a runner until a few years ago. My doctor would always say, "You need to stop running on cement, or just stop running altogether, because you're going to ruin your knees." And I'm like, "Doc, I played basketball, so that ship has sailed. I'm good." Turns out that he was right, and I had to have knee surgery. And my surgeon said, "You can't carry those big giant lenses out in the field for a while." So I focused on landscapes, which require smaller lenses. And I got into that. My knee eventually healed. And so I thought, well, why not combine the two things? Like, two great tastes taste great together kind of thing. Reese's peanut butter cup of photography, in order to show wildlife in their environments, and tell a better story of these creatures that we share the planet with. So some of you are probably saying, well, you just showed us, this is supposed to be about birds, and you just showed us a bunch of mammal pictures. And I did that with a purpose, to make a point that when you're talking about BIPOC individuals and communities and nature, we're always trying to be lured into nature with exotic species and activities. And I want to make the counter argument here. And so this is, I have fallen prey a little bit to some of these notions, and I've gone great distances to take pictures, but that's not how I started. So back to my photographic journey, my wife, Florangela Davila, who is the news director of KNKX and our dog, Santana Banana, we started to facilitate my emerging hobby and goals as a photographer. We started going to a bunch parks all over the place, and we'd always talk about the fact that we never saw people like ourselves there. And so Florangela encouraged me to write a opinion piece for the New York Times. The Sunday Review section is my favorite section of the paper, and yes, I read the paper version. I'm old school. So I wrote this op-ed, and it launched me into the Trail Posse in a narrative that was really counter to my own experience. My mother is from Japan, and that's where I was born. And my mom and dad loved to fish and camp, and we did that weekends, certainly all summers growing up. And my father was the scoutmaster of Troop 14 on Beacon Hill. And this is literally what our troop looked like. This is my BFF, Gordon McHenry Jr. And that's me on the right, just to avoid any confusion. Gordon is now the president and CEO of United Way of King County, kind of a big deal. And I'm here talking to you. So we both did pretty well coming out of this environment. And James Rasmussen, who I showed you in the land acknowledgement, also was in our troop. And we had other Black American kids, Asian American kids, Indigenous, Latinx, and some white kids. So recreating outdoors in a diverse environment was normal to us until Gordon and I went to Seattle University, and the scene started being portrayed like this. Not noisy, but white, and getting whiter. So lately, you've seen stories with verbiage like, our public lands have a diversity problem, or the outdoors has a race problem. Like, what? We've all kind of been bamboozled, in my opinion, into accepting a myth that gets perpetuated to keep intact the white supremacist roots of what I call the organized outdoors, which is recreation, conservation, and environmentalism. And that myth is that BIPOC people are not outside because we don't want to be. Like, what? Have you heard anything more ridiculous than that? And so a lot of it is how we define the outdoors. And this question that was asked by a Canadian company, we can't help but say yes, but there's reasons for that, right? We've been constantly bombarded with images like this in media and everywhere we look. And so we get this message in our head of outdoors so white. So I want to talk to you about repeating something enough times that people start believing it. Like, when does that ever happen, right? Like, stealing an election. I also wanted to introduce, this is to me the greatest opening scene in movie history. And I know I'm kind of biased, but go back and watch it. This is from White Men Can't Jump. And this is Kadeem Hardison. This is a scene of these, we're going Sizzler, we're going Sizzler. So the movie, of course, is playing on, you can't even call it a stereotype anymore because it's so accepted. And that's that white people aren't as gifted athletically and therefore are not as good as black folks in sports like basketball. And so that has played out over the decades, the fact that today, less than 10% of the NBA is composed of American-born white players. And so you can't tell me that white people can only play sports like baseball and soccer, and black folks can't, and black folk can only play basketball and football. That's ludicrous. But when something becomes established as kind of fact, then the rest of society kind of like gives you what you deserve. So this is a map of King County trail system. It is a pretty robust system, except for if you look in this, I think you can see my cursor. If you look in this area, this is where most of the BIPOC communities live in Seattle. It's where I grew up all my life. And we have this little circle here, which we'll talk about later. But the longest trail in our neighborhoods is the Chief South Trail. And it looks like this. This is what you get when people don't expect you to be outdoors. You all can just deal with that. And that's contrary to my experience and your experience. We see BIPOC people all over the place, in the city, in the mountains, sea, there's me, even in leadership in public lands management. So we are outside, we're not white, so what's the myth about? Some of us were brought to this country against our will. Some of us have been moved to deserts far away or confined to a certain industry because of our expertise on the earth. But that's being countered by the white supremacist nature of this country. This is 1903. President Teddy Roosevelt and the writer John Muir, they're meeting here at a place called Glacier Point in what would become Yosemite National Park. And they are hatching the system of national parks built on the idea of wilderness as respites from urban stressors. So you hear that term, I hear that term, it's kind of a dog whistle for us. And who's to say that wilderness and the parks were not occupied? They were occupied, of course. This country had to exterminate or move people off those lands to create wilderness and national parks. And we are, after all, a country built on stolen land and stolen labor. And in concert with that, there's mythologies about what happens to certain people in the woods, or where you get forcibly removed for just looking like the enemy. So a lot of our public lands are surrounded with places that look like this. And I originally took this photograph because of this Confederate flag looking thing, but nowadays the American flag's also a trigger of inhospitality. And when I see scenes like this, I can't help but hearing in my head, right? It's no wonder that BIPOC people prefer to recreate in groups. It speaks to our cultures that are based on a foundation of extended family, and the way this country has congregated us through methods like ghettoization or redlining. And then we've learned along the way that there's safety in numbers. So meanwhile, continue with the history of our country and the outdoors. This is 1965, and this is Paul Petzold, who founds the National Outdoor Leadership School, NOLS, N-O-L-S, which exists today. And Knowles was founded to teach people how to take other people to wild places. And Knowles is building on something that happened a year earlier in 1964, which was the signing of the Wilderness Act. Well, in 1964, another landmark piece of legislation, the Civil Rights Act, also was signed. And Dr. King starts talking about going to the mountaintop. And I can tell you what, that he's not talking about the same mountaintops that Paul Petzl was. So what gets established in this country are two parallel tracks that rarely intersect. One is the wilderness track, where people of privilege are seeking to obtain, the highest versions of themselves by tagging peaks, climbing granite walls, and hiking trails that stretch from Canada to Mexico. And then you have the civil rights tract, where people are still walking, but we're all walking the streets for basic rights. And so where do those things meet? And how does, I just want to keep emphasizing that I reject this whole thing about outdoors are white. The organized outdoors are white. But I know a place, a special place that has vistas of snow-capped mountains, has cute and charismatic wildlife. On any given day, it looks like this. And the people here this is Seward Park, if you haven't gathered by now, people who use that park will say they're on a walk. And if you describe what they actually did, which is walking around a 2.5-mile loop around the only old growth forest in the city of Seattle, through shoreline habitat, forested habitat, encountering wildlife and plant species of various people in the organized outdoors would call that loop hike. And the thing about Seward Park, it's nestled in zip code 98118, which has 78 different languages spoken, the most of any zip code in the country. And for a vast majority of those languages do not have equivalent words that for the terms that make up the lexicon of American recreation. And so that's a problem. I'll have let my friend Nancy Fernandez explain this further.
We never talk about this in Spanish, there's no discussion about going hiking. So it's una caminata. And then I asked my parents, how do you say hiking? What does this mean? And I acted out, they're like, oh, una caminata or tienda de campaña. These words, I have never used them in Spanish because there's just no discussion about this at all in my family.
So what I'm trying to convey is a sense that certain activities don't count just because we don't name them or consider them like the mainstream does. And so it turns out that when we talk to ourselves, we ask ourselves in terms that we understand, and in languages we understand, the picture is completely different. So I'm a founding member of the Next 100 Coalition, and in 2016, you remember that election, right? We commissioned a survey of voters of color. It turns out that 70% of BIPOC people responded participate in outdoor activities on a regular basis. And their support of public lands is into the 90s. And so the difference is how we look at ourselves. And we keep getting this message that we're not outdoors, which is ludicrous if you think about it, because we're always outdoors. The minute we step outside to take out the garbage, go to work, walk our dogs, we're outside, and it's just a matter of changing our perspective and just looking up. In this way, I get inspiration not only from my immigrant mother, but my immigrant mother-in-law and aunt, who look at nature and the outdoors the way they look at a Costco membership. It's a benefit of membership in this country, of citizenship, to enjoy these places. And I just want to stop here for a second just to reinforce the whole narrative that we need to take BIPOC people outside, get them into nature. I just totally reject, because it's not true. We are outside. There's so much evidence to the contrary, and this narrative is driving money and effort into the millions of dollars into what I call taking inner city kids to the parks. And to me, it's kind of like trying to train a generation of runners and starting them off in marathons, or put it another way, to try to convert a classical music buff into another genre by playing them one hip hop song. Like, how far is that going to go? And so I've tried to, I've landed on this notion of nearby nature. It's not something I invented, but it's something I endorse, to get people to understand that we are already outdoors. And so it makes it a smaller leap to go down the street to a park, and then maybe you work your way up to going to national parks, but it's not a essential ingredient of being outside. And so, for example, you could hop in a car and drive, excuse me, I'm getting choked up over this, and drive 4 or 5 hours to a scene like this, an Olympic National Park. Or you could do what I do and walk 5 minutes to Kubota Garden and see something very similar. And who's to say one is better than the other? It's just a value that society has put on it that I think we need to change. A couple of years ago, I monitored an osprey nest. These are the expert fishers of the bird world. And I did that for about 4 or 5 months. And between their antics and behaviors, it was a show that was unlike anything I could see even on Netflix. And yet it was set, surprisingly, in the shadow of Husky Stadium, right in the middle of the city of Seattle. And when I was monitoring that nest, there's a lot of standing around and waiting for things to happen. And, of course, my mind would wander. And a lot of times I thought of this scene. This is a picture that's on the wall in my house here, because it reminds me of the peace I felt watching the moon set behind the Continental Divide and reflected in this beautiful lake in Rocky Mountain National Park. It also reminds me of about half an hour later when the sun started to rise. So I packed up my gear, the lights changed, I'm walking to my car, and I see an osprey up close, live and up close for the first time in my life. And this is, it's basking in the glow of a rising sun. So into it allows me to walk pretty close, because back then I didn't have big lenses, so I had to be pretty close to take this. And you had to ask yourself, like, this osprey, like, this is so great, I want to see it again. Do I have to really go back to Colorado? Of course I didn't. I just proved to myself that there are osprey sunrises right where I live. So let's not fall victim to these, the pressure to get outside and go far away and to see exotic things. So if we want to look at birds and photograph birds, like, how do we get started? Like, how do we do something like this? This is in my backyard. And this cedar waxwing has a goofy look on its face because it's feeding on mountain ash berries, which when they get old and fermented like that, give you a buzz. So those waxwings come and they strip those berries off really quick. Let's start in your backyard. Hang a feeder. There's plenty of drama and beef at my feeder, and lots of opportunities to take photos and to watch behavior. And so progressing from there, some of you could just walk right down the street to a neighbor, and there's a bar. There might be a barred owl, especially in the city. And then you might go a little bit further. They're certainly in Seward Park. And then you might, like I do, I'm really into the owls, and I see them in the city, but also drive to what I call the Great White North, which to me is anything north of Chinatown International District, actually. But this is probably up in the Samish Flats, probably about 90 minutes north of Seattle. In that progression, you see owls like this, or long-eared owls. And bird watchers and photographers go crazy over this particular owl, which is a snowy owl. And I love it because they look like they're wearing too much eyeliner all the time. And this is the owl made famous in the Harry Potter movies. This photo I had to go to Canada to take this. And the thing about snowy owls is they're only in our area every 6 to 10 years in things called eruptions. So if you're asking yourself, do I have to wait 10 years and then go to Canada to see these birds? Like, well, not necessarily. Last year, in fact, if you'd gone up to Queen Anne at the end of the year, there's a snowy owl that was hanging up on rooftops for about 2 months. This is probably the most dramatic wildlife photo that I've ever taken. And of course, it was taken up in the Great White North. But I don't need to go that far to take photos as artistic of great blue herons. After all, it's the official bird of the city of Seattle. The thing about birds is that they connect us. They move around, they migrate, they connect us to different places and to different people, and also they connect us to our own heritage. And so this is a barn swallow. A lot of wildlife photographers don't like man-made elements in their photos, but I did this on purpose because this is a photo at Heart Mountain in Wyoming, where Japanese Americans like myself were incarcerated, mostly from the LA area in this case, were incarcerated during World War II. And I took this picture on the left is a painting of how Heart Mountain looked during the war, the barracks of the prison, and how it looks now. And the birds connect me to personal experience. I climbed that mountain with a big giant lens, it was crazy, in grizzly country, so I could take a picture of a grouse. And you know, heightened sense, it was crazy at the time, but I look back on it, I guess with pleasure. My friend Drew Lanham of Rules of the Black Bird Watcher fame, he talks about range maps, which you've all seen, which are depict the geographic distribution of birds and other wildlife. And he talks about range maps in terms of humans by race, which help him know where he can be and where he shouldn't be. He also says that black birders should adopt all black birds, and he's showing a picture of a red-winged blackbird here, and I think that's a good idea. So when you're out in nature as a BIPOC person, I think names start also becoming important. I think names are always important. This is my friend Danae Shorter, and we're standing in front of a lake that until a few years ago was called Coon Lake, and its name has since been changed to Howard Lake in honor of a black prospector who used to be in that area. My partners in this presentation and one of the sponsors of the Refuge Outdoor Festival, Seattle Audubon, has actually taken a national leadership position in re-examining the Audubon name. So Audubon's namesake, John James Audubon, was a slaveholder, slave trader, and white supremacist. Seattle Audubon also is a vanguard of standing against, I'm going to mispronounce this, but eponymous names, which are like honorifics, naming things, wildlife, and places after people, which is so Western. And you have examples like the Bell's vireo, which is an endangered species. My friend just did a podcast about it in Southern California. And that's named after Alexander Bell, who was a eugenist, was a racist, actually. So paying attention to names is important. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, thanking you all for listening to my rants and ideas about race in the outdoors. And as a gift, we're going to talk about some bird photography tips. And if you're not into bird photography, this is just an opportunity to look at some pretty pictures, I guess. I picked this, I guess, you know, yellow birds, I guess Asian American birds, we can adopt these. But I picked this photo because it represents some of the elements you want to look for in trying to take pictures of birds. And one is gesture. You know, this bird is making eye contact. It's on a perch, which is a little bit unusual, cattail. And gesture conveys emotion to the viewer. Good light. So I kind of fudge on this a little bit. you can see, I like to have a little bit once in a while of shadow on the sides. It conveys a dimensionality to the photos, but some people don't like that. And the best light is about a half hour before and 90 minutes after sunrise and sunset. And the exceptions to that is if there are cloudy skies, which gives you filtered light. And the whole purpose is to get even lighting. You also want to get good direction. So a way to do that is to point your own shadow at your subject, because that means the sun's behind you. And one of the cues that I've done that is the sun is reflected in this bird's eye. So I've gotten good even distribution of light. And then the smooth background is achieved through doing what's called shooting wide open, which means using the biggest aperture that your lens will allow you to do. And that's denoted kind of counterintuitively by smaller numbers. So the smaller numbered f-stop that your lens will allow you to go. And also, if the background of your subject is farther away from the subject than you are, in other words, maybe I'm 20 yards away from this goldfinch and the background's 40 yards away, you start to get this kind of even background. And you want to also look for that evenness when you're shooting. The last thing I'll say is that the eyes always have it. And if you want to get anything in your wildlife photos sharp, it's the eyes. And also this catch light conveys a sense of, gives the eyes life. And so I want to show you some examples. Oops, if I can get this. Gestures. Catch them doing something different or kind of vaguely familiar. Backgrounds. Usually we don't like boring skies that'll give you this kind of white background. But in this case, I want people to know that this is winter in Yellowstone National Park. So white background is appropriate. If I had stood behind and to the left of this downy woodpecker, there would be a stand of trees and the background would be all like this tree, and the woodpecker wouldn't stand out as well. Smooth background. And getting eye level is another key. And in this case, with the sandhill crane, they're pretty tall birds, so that's fairly easy. With western sandpipers, not so easy. These are tiny birds. And so what I've done here, this is at Ocean Shores, I kind of dug in a little bit to the sand and I'm lying on my belly to get eye level. The other thing that I did, which is key to improving your photographs, your wildlife photographs, is paying attention to behavior. So I watched these birds before I set up, and I saw that they're wave runners. In other words, when the tide goes out, they run out toward the water where the sand is softer and they can it's easier for them to pull up food like this sandworm. And then when the tide comes back in, they run ahead of the waves, and then they resume the same kind of behavior. And so I kind of watched to see where they would land, and that's where I set up and then got this picture. So the same kind of way of thinking here with these tree swallows. There's this snag here that was, which seemed to be like a center, a hub of activity for these birds. And I watched, and I wanted to capture some of these kind of mid-air interactions. And so this actually, if I remember correctly, it's a few years ago, I spent 4 or 5 hours doing this. First, figuring out what they're doing, and then trying to get close enough. And so inching up a little by little, and you don't want to go straight, and you don't want to make eye contact. You want them to accept you, which allowed me to get close enough to take this. The other thing about tree swallows, you all have seen them outside above water surfaces or in meadows and fields, and they're really fast, erratic flyers because they're catching insects. And so I found them to be great subject to practice getting photos like this, which is called a bird in flight. And if you can follow a tree swallow, you can follow a lot of other things. The thing about behavior, we all of us in the animal kingdom, we're creatures of habit. That's why there's a term that we return to things over and over again. In the case of predators or birds of prey, like the short-eared owl, they all have their favorite perches because they've experienced success in the hunt, either finding prey or landing prey, and they return to them. So I've gotten to know these short-eared owls, again, up in the Great White North pretty well. So I know this perch. I set up for this perch, waited for the light of a setting sun, getting orange, and then waiting for this bird to make a gesture. Their gesture. They get curious. It was lean in, made eye contact, and bam. So I'm showing you this picture. It's not a great picture. The face is not really in focus, and then we got this boring sky. But I wanted to give you a tip on this. This bird has just expelled waste material. I don't know how better to say it. And it's a tell for a lot of birds that they lighten their load, I guess, before they take off. And bigger birds will have tells like spreading their wings and kind of tensing up. And if you're waiting for this moment, if you want to get the birds in flight, and it's much easier to follow a bird from a stationary position, let me tell you, than trying to pick them and get focus in midair. So see this, and you start your burst mode, and then when the bird is out here, this is a juvenile bald eagle, was about out here, you have a bird in flight shot. So there's always exceptions to everything. When Pacific Northwest Magazine decided to publish my essay about the osprey nest, the editors asked me if I had a photo like this, which may have had a gray or white background, so they could put in type elements. So there's always uses and exceptions. Long-eared owl, favorite perch, showing the long ears. They're not always extracted like this. Gesture, light, light reflected in his eyes, and then the background. So this is actually not a great photo. It's almost a great photo, and that's why I'm showing it. A lot of wildlife photographers like this glow, capture their subject in this glow, and then this is a northern harrier actually also carrying its dinner. So it could have been a really interesting photo, except I wasn't paying total attention to the background. I get this darkness up in the upper left-hand corner, and a viewer's eyes can't help but go there to distract you from them. So the point is, pay attention out in the field to what your background is. If we see over here on the right, if I had taken a few steps over and adjusted my angle, I would have had a glow around, totally around this animal. So I want to tell you just a quick story about putting all these together. For years, my nemesis bird in photography was the belted kingfisher. And I see these birds, well, first they're noisy, so you hear them first, all the time along Lake Washington and Seward Park. And a lot of times I'm not carrying a camera, or when I am, they're just so fast and loose. I've never got a really good picture. So I was determined this past winter to get pick a good picture of a kingfisher. And I happened to hear about this place called Wiley Slough up in the Great White North again, between Mount Vernon and LaConner. So I started going up there, and it's a great place to bird or photograph birds. And I discovered there's a pair of kingfishers up there. So I started following them around, listening for them, watching where they were, and I got this picture. And so, evenly lit, the sun is my back, and also you can tell, because this bird is flying toward us, that the wind is also in my back, because birds will fly into the wing to get lift. So we have that, but this background is a little bit distracting and problematic. So I have to, even though this is probably the best at the time that I've taken, I wanted to find better ones like this. And so I'm close. I've got action. I've got a decent background. It's kind of boring, but it still gives you a sense of where this is. And you can see a little bit of light of sunrise. And the thing I discovered, well, let's roll back a little bit. So in the animal world, it's the males who are usually the most colorful and the prettiest, just like the human species. except in kingfishers, it's the female that has the color, this rust belt on its underside. And the thing I discovered that's not in any books or websites is that females are more tolerant of human presence. And it's not just this one, but this is a female, and here's a tail, the steel line. We're not in Kansas anymore. We're actually in the city. This female's got me, let me come really close, and then gave me some attitude, right? And didn't fly off. Allowed me to watch this behavior. This is actually a terrible photograph. Busy background, the lights in the back, so it's harsh, but it's interesting behavior, and people actually have liked this photograph way more than the one before. The other kind of gestures and environments, reflections, I really love this greater yellow legs. This is one of the most, and again, this is a male. This is a wood duck. Beautiful bird in a glassy water surface, the great reflection. And you get this kind of reflection early in the day or later at night because the wind hasn't picked up. And in my experience, it's more prevalent earlier in the day. Another reason to get up early is light. And in this case, I'm not shooting with light behind me, I'm shooting into it. So I get this silhouette and show the light reflecting off the water. So I want to leave you with kind of two related thoughts before we go to my partner, Wendy Walker of Seattle Audubon, that there is nothing, there's no such thing as just a. And in this case, there's no such thing as just a sparrow. You see sparrows everywhere, but sparrow in this environment is beautiful, right? And there's no such thing as just BIPOC people who don't go outdoors. We're outdoors in every way imaginable, doing everything and maybe not calling it the same as the mainstream does. So we don't always get counted, but we know better, right? We are outside, damn it. Santana Banana wouldn't use that kind of language, but I'm inserting it for her. And so if we're outside, wherever we are, so are the birds. Just look up. Or you'll learn once in a while you look down. And maybe photographing or following birds will be a gateway for you to look for other kind of animal or photograph other kind of animals. And even if it doesn't, that's great because there are so many interesting birds like this northern shrike, the killer songbird, the only songbird that is carnivorous, and it's got, if you look carefully, it's got a little notch in its beak that allows it to kill its prey by puncturing its neck. And less morbid, a common species. If you around Lake Washington, you look out on these buoys, you see what I call the Batman birds because they're standing with their wings, drying out their wings because they dive into the water to catch fish. This is a scene that looks like any day in my house where one of us is tuning out the other. But you see these great behaviors, and these birds also have beautiful emerald eyes. So look for the unexpected, and you'll find it everywhere. Thanks a lot for following along. These are various ways that you can follow my work or contact me if you have questions. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A because Wendy and I are committed to hanging around long enough to answer as many as we can. So I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Wendy Walker of Seattle Audubon, who will give you some ways to capitalize on some of the things that I brought up.
Thanks, Glenn, and good morning, everyone. As Glenn said, my name is Wendy Walker. I am from Seattle Audubon, and I'm going to share a little bit about some tools that, and I'll call it now, tools for how you can disrupt that narrative that BIPOC people aren't outdoors. I'm going to go ahead and ask to share my screen. and start a little slideshow of my own with the disclaimer that none of these photos are going to be as good as Glenn's. But I'll start with just a little bit about me. So that's me there with my binoculars, and that's pretty common these days. But I did not grow up considering myself a birder or even know what that meant. But I use these two birds on the other side of the screen to show how I started looking at birds was totally through my dad, was just being outdoors in our farm in Ohio, and red-tailed hawks were everywhere. So just being out with my dad, we were looking at birds all the time, but just because they were our neighbors, they were just creatures that we lived with. And this bird on the bottom is called a killdeer, and it's a shorebird, but it actually lays its nest. It lays its eggs on rocky substrate. So my job when I was a kid was to walk the farm field, find the killdeer nests so that my dad could plow around them. So that was actually also kind of one of my first conservation lessons. He loved the animals around us. So he wanted to figure out how we could live with them. So that's just a little bit about my background. So now I call myself a birder, and I actually work at Seattle Audubon. And we are one of 400 Audubon chapters, but one of the few that actually is in an urban surrounding and is staffed. So I'm lucky enough to now have this as my job. We're one of 3 Audubon entities in Seattle. So there is the Seward Park Audubon Center, as well as our state chapter, Audubon Washington, which has its offices at Seward Park. One of the first conservation goals that this Audubon chapter was formed was to create Seward Park as a bird sanctuary, to advocate for cats to be indoors, and to stop timber poaching from city parks. Well, it turns out over 100 years later, we're still kind of working on the same things, but now we also have birds colliding with glass as an additional big problem that we spend a lot of time on. So that's a little bit about us. And if you are now interested, because you've heard Glenn's compelling talk, on maybe starting to spend more time thinking about watching birds intentionally, there's a bunch of things that we can offer, or they're just resources out there, and a lot of them are free and really easy to access. And really the first is to build on that idea that just look up, is noticing birds wherever you are. This is one of my photos, is Canada geese and snow geese. Yes, I'm sorry, Glenn, they're white birds. And these were at Gasworks Park. So I was just there walking with a friend and happened to look around, as Glenn said, and then you find the unusual. These snow geese don't usually hang around in Seattle parks. They're usually up more in like the Skagit Valley, but this day they just happened to be hanging out with a couple Canada geese. So I thought that was pretty cool. We'll talk a little bit about attracting birds to wherever it is that you spend time, whether you have a backyard or a courtyard or even a balcony. You can hang certain kinds of things that will attract birds. I'll give you some apps and resources, and then talk about branching out. So you do want to go out to a park. So again, noticing birds wherever you are. This is a photo from a friend from her dentist's office on the 10th story of a building downtown Seattle. And this gull was just really curious, so she took his photo. Also just talk about the ways you can go birding. You can go birding by yourself. That is perfectly, that's just one way. And you might be out in a natural area, or you might be doing this in your own backyard, or as Glenn said, on the way to the bus stop. The birds are already everywhere. It's just how you choose to start thinking about them. Birding can also look like going out in a multi-generational family to a natural area. This happens to be at the Yesler Swamp at Union Bay Natural Area, which is a super easy loop, wheelchair accessible, small person accessible if you have an assist to get you up on the top of the railing like that, and just lots of varieties of birds that are pretty up close. It can also look like hanging out with your friends on a school trip. These were teens that we worked with to do some community science projects. They were learning how to count seabirds as part of the Puget Sound Seabird Survey. And you can see this is in West Seattle looking back over downtown. So it doesn't have to be a massive green space. Sometimes the birds will tell you where they're going to be. And sometimes birding looks like this. This was at Refuge Outdoor Festival in person in August. And we just sat in a circle with no optics at first and just noticed what was making sound around us, and just kind of listening to the landscape and starting to pick out birds that way. So birding can look like a lot of different things. So let's say you want to bring birds to you. So there's a couple things to think about, and it depends on what kind of space you live in. But there's a couple different ways to feed birds or provide water, and we're going to talk about those. And one resource for that can be a place like Seattle Audubon Society, because we have a retail store. And I know Glenn's very familiar with this place. And you can come to the Nature Shop. This is a picture of the outside of the building as it was last year, but we've done some improvements. We actually added a beautiful art design to our front windows, working with artist Angelina Villalobos, and she designed this beautiful varied thrush patterning. And this is both to make our windows bird safe, meaning a bird will no longer look at the window and think it can fly through it, but it also helps us start that conversation. So anyway, our building got an uplift during the last year. And when you come inside, you're going to see a lot of ways to get engaged with birds. So we do sell and rent and offer to borrow optics, and I can tell you more about that. But we also have lots of books, guidebooks. If you're interested in learning more and identifying the birds or reading about natural history of birds or lots of other stuff, we also have lots of children's books. If you have a young person who wants to get involved, and then there's the feeding birds and bringing them to your backyard. So there's kind of three main types of bird feeding. You can do nectar feeding. You see some hummingbird feeders hanging here. You can feed suet, or you can feed seed. And suet, seed, we'll start with seed. Different kinds of seed attracts different birds. So you can do it this way. You can have feeders that you set up, or you can make your own. You can actually just get seed and compress them. This is actually a little recipe using basically glycerin to hold, or corn syrup to hold seed together. You can make your own ornaments. You don't even need a feeder. Suet's another option, and it attracts lots of different kinds of birds. This is a female northern flicker, which is a kind of woodpecker, and this is in my backyard. So I don't take great artistic photos, but I like looking back on what's visited my yard. So this female often visits my suet feeder, as does this Townsend's warbler, which is always a surprise to me in the winter. So, and again, this is my little tiny little yard that isn't even particularly surrounded by greenery, but it's just enough that the birds find me because I feed them. Hummingbird feeders will attract, our Anna's hummingbird is here year round. Lots of people like to bring them into the yard because they're just so cool to watch. And I love this particular photo because it shows the tiny little feet. This is not my photo, but this is one way to, again, attract hummingbirds to your yard is with nectar feeding. The other element is water. Let's say you live on a balcony, or you live in a housing situation where the rules don't allow bird feeding, but maybe they'll allow you to have a bird bath, and all you have to do is maintain the clean water. I get a great variety of birds just that come to the water that don't even necessarily feed. I love this one. This is 2 red-breasted nuthatches, including a little baby on the one side. So that was the parent actually bringing its fledgling from that year, learning where there was a good water source. The other way that lots of people love to do is, if you have the ability to plant in your yard, is to really start to find out what native plants in particular support not only fruit, but also support insect populations. Our birds need insects. Almost all birds eat insects or feed them to their young. Even hummingbirds, while we see the adults feeding on nectar, they need insects to feed to their babies. So I think of myself as an insect farmer in my backyard, and that means I try to have a variety of plants growing, leave things messy in the fall because that helps insects hide and create more insects. So if you can think about cultivating insects, you'll get more birds. Plant flowers that leave their seeds. This black-capped chickadee on a sunflower is a great example of just letting things go to seed, gives the bird their natural food wherever you are. So I'm going to touch on something Glenn started talking about. Now we're going to talk a little bit about identification, but before saying that, I'll say, who are you, bird? Well, birds' names in English, a lot of them are those eponymous names. And you can learn more about this, this movement to rethink about how birds are named, to maybe birds should be named by descriptive things and not honorifics, because then you just get out of that problem of having them named after some people who've done some pretty horrific things. But it's bigger than that. It's how do we really know a bird do you really know it just because you know its name, or is that just a partial way of knowing a bird? So if you want to learn more about that movement, birdnamesforbirds.wordpress.com is where you can go to learn about how that's all progressing. And I do this specifically because now we're going to talk about one resource for you for identifying birds and actually learning their current English common names. So Merlin Bird ID is a great free app. It's from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The website's there, merlin.allaboutbirds.org, or visit your app store on your smartphone. And it will give you a step-by-step bird ID. You can also record sound on your phone and ask it to identify by that bird song, which is amazing. Or you can hold up your microphone. If you're close enough to a bird to get its song, it'll just identify it for you. You can identify a bird by a photo that you took or a photo that you found on the internet and you just want to know what it is. It also has lists to help you find specific birds near you. So this bird, I'm going to use this black and blue bird that Glenn showed earlier to show you how Merlin Bird ID works. And basically you start the bird ID on the app and it's going to ask you a bunch of questions, including where are you? What was the date? You can kind of see that up there. I was in Seattle on September 17th. I pick the main two colors and it's going to come up with a list of what birds that likely is. So a black and blue bird in Seattle on September 17th was probably a Steller's jay. The fact that it's named a Steller's jay is part of that question about bird names for birds, but that's what you're currently going to find it called. Also on seattleaudubon.org, we have a bunch of free resources, including, this is just the front cover of a little book called Common Birds of Seattle. It's a field guide for youth, but just because we kind of directed it towards younger people doesn't mean it's not a nice little guide. It's got about 20 of the most common birds that you're going to start with seeing in Seattle, and a little bit of information about them, a little journal. So this is just a fun activity if you just want to start in your own yard or your neighborhood park. Sit down with this book and you'll quickly start to know which are the most common birds around you. On the website, we also have videos for really small kids. We call it Fledglings and Friends. It's usually a story time with a craft. And because of COVID, we put those all online last year. You can find our calendar of classes, events, and field trips and bird walks. So that's all, doing stuff with other people. But again, all of this can be done on your own, with your family, with a small group. We can facilitate you borrowing binoculars or renting entire exploration kits. So there's lots of ways to do this. At some point, it would be lovely to do bird walks again with everyone. We're doing field trips for small groups right now, but we like to open back up to have times when we can go out birding together with no sign up. We also offer a Young Birders Teen program, which will kick off again now with the school year. Another great free resource is birdweb.org. So there's lots of online sources for bird information. This one happens to be just the birds of Washington State. So you can be sure that you're going to get local information. And if you're wondering if you saw a bird, then if you're looking it up on BirdWeb, that's a bird that has been seen in Washington State. If you search some of the national, you can find some lookalikes, but you quickly figure out, oh, that's not really what I saw, or probably not what I saw because it's way out of its own range. There's also descriptions of birding sites and where and when to find birds in Washington, west or east. So if this sounds like a lot, just know the very first thing you can do is just literally walk outside and just start listening or looking. I did a little bit of where are you bird, because there are some fun places to go birding, particularly if you want to start seeing more species. But again, quantity over quality is not necessarily the way to go. You might be really happy just getting really familiar with 2 or 3 birds that are in your neighborhood and then going out to, bigger areas. Or maybe you're already going to these places to walk or to rollerblade or to ride your bike. And you can add being aware of the birds around you, because now you have some tools to start doing that. So it can be an additive thing too. It doesn't have to be the main focus of what you're doing. It just kind of adds on to the experience to realize that the birds were already there too. So I've got the link to this map and we can share that in the chat as well. And these are just some that I pulled up because they're places that I like going to bird. And then I'll just want to leave you with kind of with what Glenn was saying is these birds, and I picked these ones in particular because they are literally all around us. I could probably go, with the exception of the osprey, which I don't see every day, but see regularly in Seattle. I could probably go on a walk in my neighborhood even in the next hour in the rain and see an American robin and some, rock pigeons and a white-crowned sparrow, which I hear regularly when I'm riding the bus in downtown Seattle. They're so loud, I hear them over the bus and traffic noise. The osprey, the American crow, and of course our swallows. So they're all out there, and it's really just, they're just there waiting for you to play with them. This is a photo back from Refuge Outdoor Festival in person a couple years ago. And one of the things that Audubon likes to promote is just let's go birding together. It can be a super inclusive and really easy way to just add on to something that you're already doing. So thanks for listening. And Glenn, I don't know if you want to come back on and just say goodbye to our fine friends or see what questions we might have.
I'm back. I got a haircut for this, but I'm going to show my true colors, my
Nice.
favorite birds. If anyone has any questions, we're committed to hanging around. Tips for photographing hummingbirds. Dakota, thanks. Maybe Wendy has some ideas, but hummingbirds, like tree swallows, are erratic. They fly quickly, but a lot of I got the Seahawks thing on. And Russell Wilson also says separation is in the preparation. So preparation would be the key for me to set up by either a hummingbird feeder, or hummingbirds are attracted to red plants that are in the red color scheme, though I've also seen them, on yellow, but they're searching for nectars. And just at my home, I would observe where I see the hummingbirds most often and set up. And while they do flitter around, they hover when they're eating, or they perch. People, I know when I hike with people, they're often surprised at, like, what's that kind of squeaky noise that I'm hearing? And it's actually a hummingbird. They're noisy, and they perch on trees and bushes and places that you don't really expect. But I'd say set up in front of a feeder or a place or a bush that you see them often, and just be ready.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I just say about the hummingbirds that come to my feeder, I purposely have it hanging where there is a shrub nearby, because they're very territorial. So they will often perch in the shrub and kind of guard. They're guarding their food source. So that's where you can also get them in a still shot. The photographing a hummingbird in flight or hovering is definitely trickier, but if you don't mind getting the still shots, then you can look for that place where they're guarding their food from.
Tips for using your iPhone to photograph birds. Man, I think a lot of people already know how to do this based on all the texts I get, because even though I'm not that big, I'm certainly not as good as identifying birds as Wendy is. But I get questions. I'm the best. I'm the biggest expert that a lot of people know. So I get texts. I'd say the great blue heron is a great subject, because they're really tolerant, especially when they're hunting. They're so focused. So if you see great blue herons in the water and they're poised looking for fish, they're so focused they don't notice you. Just so you don't come running up and go, oh, look, it's a great blue heron, I'm gonna take it. So I'd say tolerant species like that, or species that are perched. I think you could even, I've gotten photos of Cooper's hawk with my iPhone. The trick that Paul Bannock taught me about birds of prey is, and I found that to be true with wildlife and other predators, they don't like to be looked in the eye. They don't like eye contact because they read as a threat. And then in the case of birds, they know you're bigger than they are, so they'll the fight or flight things, they will flight. Bears won't. So as long as you're not looking, making eye contact, and then moving slowly and not in a straight line. So in other words, kind of zigzagging. Some species, if you're chewing gum or making that chomping kind of gesture, we'll see that you're not looking for food. So you're not considering them as food. So getting close enough to use your iPhone would be the key, and then trying out on species that are tolerant of presence.
Yeah, the only other way that I use my cell phone to take photos, and this is a different tactic, right, is if you do have binoculars, you can actually hold your binoculars up and focus your phone through one of the eye cups and get a little bit more distance on it. But it takes practice, and often I use those photos for just identification purposes. Like maybe I'm not sure what that bird is and I want to take a photo to look at it later. I'm surprised sometimes by how well they come out. So that can be fun to play with. But if it's just the phone, I would say the same thing as Glenn, is just try it out on species like ducks that are pretty tolerant. I've had ducks swim straight up to me. Of course, they're sometimes responding that they've been fed in the past, which I don't necessarily encourage, but they'll come right up to you at the water's edge. Or not only just moving slowly, but sit in a single place for 20 minutes and see what comes close to you. Once you settle in and kind of become part of the landscape, birds that aren't typically tolerant might come surprisingly close, and you can get some pretty fun photos that way too.
Anyone else? As I mentioned, I posted a link to notes for this. A lot of the things I covered, and I'm going to add some of the things that Wendy brought up, and it'll always be up on trailposse.com that you can refer to, as well as drop me a line. I have my email address up there.
Great.
I obviously love talking about both birds and BIPOC people in the outdoors.
That's great. I would encourage the same thing, particularly for folks who might be looking for some of these resources or borrowing optics. If you have a group that you know you want to take out, feel free to get in touch and we can talk about options for that. We do regularly loan binoculars to groups, or as I said, we have like exploration kits where, particularly for people that might be working with an entire youth group, you can borrow resources just to share out. But we're, as an organization, we are, as Seattle Audubon is definitely in that category of organized environmentalism, and we do have conservation work that we're trying to do, but we also exist to try and help people just appreciate birds in whatever way works for you.
I'm going to make this plug. They didn't ask me to, for Seattle Audubon, because almost everything I described, I started out looking for them at Seattle Audubon. As Wendy mentioned, they have a lot of my money in that nature shop, and I got to know Russ Steele, who operated the nature shop for many years. I consider him a friend. He's helped me buy all kinds of optics, books, and seed. And then hopefully when the pandemic subsides, there'll be live events again. And the first bird walks that I took were through Seattle Audubon. One of the most memorable ones was Florangela and I and Santana Banana went on I think it was Birding with Dogs session a few years ago. So Seattle Audubon is definitely a great resource for what you need and how to apply. The Seward Park Audubon Center, also when it opens up, is a great source of all those too. And then you got Joey Manson there, who we all love.
Indeed. Thanks for that plug, Glenn. I will say I did forget to mention that we are having an open optics night on September 21st. So the Nature Shop staying open a few hours into the evening from 5 to 7. And it's a chance to just come try out binoculars or look through a scope. If you are considering adding optics to the way that you bird, it's trying them out to find what binoculars actually work for you. I feel really strongly like there's no one best kind of binocular. Like the one that works for you is the one that's the right weight. It fits good in your hand. It fits your face. So trying them out is a really valuable thing to do before you decide to purchase. So come see us September 21st from 5 to 7, or any other time. The shop's now open for optics, or trying out optics. But this is a way to see a whole bunch of them at the same time.
That's how I got to know Russ, by the way. We spent hours together trying out all kinds of different binoculars and scopes.
Nice. And he will still be there. He's 20 plus years with the organization and is still like a wonderful, wonderful person to buy optics from.
I feel like I should throw on some music so we can do a dance party. I know there's some of the audience is on Facebook Live, so of course you can't ask questions this way. You're not on our platform. Drop us a line and look at the notes. Actually, since you maybe can't see the chat, is that right, Dakota? My site is trailposse.com, so it's trailposse.com/refuge-outdoor. You can find notes and then links to all the things that we talked about. Stories were referenced and the resources that Wendy referenced.
Great. Well, Glenn, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you were interested in doing this together, and just very, very happy to have you being an advocate for people in the outdoors, and particularly BIPOC people enjoying the outdoors, because you know it better than anyone. Everyone's already there. It's just giving people resources to go out and do it the way they want.
Thanks, Wendy. It was great. This has been great. I can't say enough how, over the years, how supportive that you've been of my work, and Seattle Audubon has been of my work. And I love birds, and there's no better organization to connect with on that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I can't wait to go. Can't wait to go birding with you.
Soon.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much for spending part of your Saturday morning with us.
Honor.